Hi, everyone. Again, welcome to the ongoing series Inside the Investigation from FIJ. My name is Ellen Weiss, and I'm a very proud board member of FIJ. Just a little bit of context. We started this series in the spring for a couple of reasons. We get to shine a light on some really wonderful and impactful investigative work, and we actually get to hear from the people who did it about how they did their groundbreaking investigations. We get to share concrete tips and resources that all of you and other journalists can use in your work. We get to feature investigations that were produced with the fund's support, and we're going to talk more about how you can apply for FIJ grants and how we can help you. We'll do that at the end of this webinar. Just a little bit of housekeeping. I'm going to talk with our guests for about 20, 30 minutes maybe. If you have questions at any point, you can just add them whenever they occur to you to the Q&A section. And also, we are recording this webinar, and what we're going to do is we're going to post the video and the tip sheet on the FIJ website, so you don't have to take notes if you don't want to. You're going to be safe. Also, for anybody who registered, we'll also send you an email with the video. So with all that, let's get started. The topic today is deaths in county jails. This is a serious problem across the country. The number of jail deaths is increasing. It's also a really hard issue to report on because there's just so much secrecy around jail deaths. As I was getting ready for this webinar, I read a Senate report that found that even publicly available data, like from the DOJ, it dramatically undercounts the number of deaths in the US jails. And so that secrecy makes it really difficult to hold jail systems accountable and to intervene in this ongoing crisis. Hiding both the scope and details of in-custody deaths means that those who are still alive may be subject to many of the same deadly conditions. And so it also means figuring out the best way to address the problem can be really out of reach. Journalism right now is one of the most important ways to address this problem, to give the public and elected officials a much clearer picture of the scale and the cost of incarceration in their own communities. And this is happening in every community. This is the important work that both our guests and their newsrooms have taken on, and we're going to hear how they did it, the obstacles they faced, and the impact that they had. So I'm going to introduce both John and Tennessee, but I'm going to start with Tennessee. Tennessee Watson is the deputy managing editor of WyoFile, a nonprofit independent news outlet in Wyoming. Her name is no hint of her background. She grew up in the Northeast and previously was an independent documentary radio producer and youth media educator, and I just learned long distance runner. In 2023, WyoFile launched an ongoing investigative series examining why people die in jail, why the public knows so little about these deaths, and how they might be avoided in the future. Suicide, it turns out, is the leading cause of jail deaths, and Wyoming jails happen to be among the most deadly in the nation for suicide. The suicide rate for the state's county jails is the fourth highest in the country. There are no laws in place requiring sheriffs to implement suicide prevention measures. Obviously, advocates think there's a lot more that can be done. 22 people who died by suicide in Wyoming county jails over the course of the decade, beginning in 2022, and that makes suicide by far the leading cause of death in Wyoming jails. And although jailers have immense control over inmates in their care, and experts say that suicide can be prevented, the problem remains unsolved. So, Tennessee, just an opening question. How did you decide to take on this story? I mean, I get the statistics, but like, how did you actually first find out about it?
Yeah, I actually didn't know anything about the statistics when I started reporting on this. And it was a combination of things. One, I'd encountered Nate Payne's reporting out of Michigan from the Traverse City Record Eagle. And I knew that he led an investigation there looking at suicides in county jails. And so I already, like, I saw another reporter do it and I was like, oh, you know, cool project. So it's really cool to see so many of you here because I think that's what got me started on this path. But then it was in the back of my mind, and then there was a tip. And there was a tip about 3 deaths in the jail in the county that I live in the span of 7 months. And so, first I started looking into that, but out of fairness to that sheriff who oversaw the Albany County Jail, I was like, I want to understand if what's happening here is an anomaly or if this is kind of on par with what's happening across the state. And so that's when I, for that initial story about those deaths in the Albany County Jail, I did this request to all 23 Wyoming counties. And, it might be getting like a little bit ahead of myself, but at that point, when I made that records request, I didn't even know that the Department of Justice was keeping track of county jail deaths. So, but I'm glad that I did it the way that I did because that data from the Department of Justice lags. And I was asking for the most current information about deaths in county jails from the past year. And I'll just leave it there. But, I got that data back and realized like, wow, we really have a problem and no one knows about it.
Yeah. And Wyoming has some real specific challenges. I think it's one of a relatively small number of states that don't have a medical detox statute, meaning like you can place a person on hold and not necessarily in jail right away if they're having other problems like drug problems. Maybe you could talk a little bit about one of the people who died in jail and actually what it means not to have the option to essentially have this civil procedure.
Yeah. So I'll start by saying that when I initially started the reporting, I was really focused on suicides and deaths attributed to use of force. That is like really what I was focusing on. And I was also, but I was getting records back telling me that people were also dying of natural causes. And they just didn't get my attention. And I think that was a mistake. But, I ended up going back and closely reading like all of the investigations that I was getting into these deaths. And I found one, Wesley Morehouse passed away of natural causes in jail. And then as I started to look more into the details, he was booked for public intoxication, but he had a really low blood alcohol level. And I think sort of by virtue of the fact that my dad is a firefighter and an EMT, I like just have been sort of exposed to, some basic stuff. And I was like, ooh, you could be diabetic, for example, or be having a stroke and you might appear drunk. And so I started to ask these questions of like, did they get it wrong with what Wesley Morehouse? Was he booked for public intox when he actually had some other health need? And long story short, it was definitely a mixture of both with Mr. Morehouse. He did have substance use issues and some other health issues going on the night that he was arrested. And he ended up booked into jail, made it through the night, but died in the morning. And when I went to report to try and like figure out what had happened, basically to say like, did you send a man to jail who should have gone to the emergency room because your, patrol officer misinterpreted the symptoms? And, folks came back and they said like, look, Mr. Morehouse was, a quote unquote frequent flyer. He did have issues with substance use. Like we saw him repeatedly and, we did take him to the emergency room. They cleared him to go to the jail. And as law enforcement officers, we don't have the authority to challenge those doctors. Like we can't force him back to the emergency room. And so we made the decision that booking him was better than him dying in an alleyway in downtown Torrington. And that is when it was revealed to me the limitations of our state statutes, that like the chief of police and the lieutenant who runs the jail just sort of like teased out that tension, which was our hands were tied. We did the best we could with the resources that we have. But the chief of police worked in a different state before he came to Wyoming. And he's the one that highlighted that, like, previously when he worked in Colorado, he had more options. And
Oh, go
yeah,
ahead.
no, you got
No, I was just gonna say that one of the things I really liked about your reporting was your interaction with the local sheriffs. I think it's easy to assume a kind of good guy, bad guy scenario that sheriffs are not the good guys, but I felt like you brought a lot of nuance to the law enforcement people that you spoke with who were really forthcoming and surprising. There was one sheriff, Brian Kozak, but just talk a little bit about how you built those relationships and those sources, because you really talked to a lot of people in the system.
yeah. I mean, I think some of the resource limitations are real. So I don't think based on the funding that they get and just the way that our public funds flow in Wyoming. I won't get into the weeds, but you can end up with under resourced county governments and sheriff's offices. And so, it's like sensitive to the fact that that might have an influence on staffing in jails, for example. But I also, to be totally honest, like I am initially going into this like really thinking about the conditions that people are incarcerated and what they're facing and their dignity, but also if there aren't good policies and procedures on the books and jails aren't well run, then it makes it more dangerous for the people who work there. And so I'm always like keeping that in my mind too, that these deaths are traumatic for the staff as well. And so I think starting from that place also like is really helpful to keep that in mind. Um, and then yeah, I just sort of trying to understand like what are the structural issues that folks that work in the jails are up against, and what kind of help would they need to want to solve that. And I will say, not every sheriff is as open to that conversation. I've done reporting in Wyoming looking at deaths in jails where the sheriff has continued to say, like, we didn't do anything wrong, nothing to see here. But there have been sheriffs who are also willing to take a step back and say, yeah, here's the limitations. Here's what I would need to make the situation better.
Yeah. Just one more question, then I'll go to John. What kind of oversight did you discover exists? I mean, does a death in a jail immediately trigger an investigation by some higher authority or the attorney general or some state investigation agency? Like, who's keeping track of all of this?
Me. I mean, I know that's like a short, snarky answer, but that's the truth. There's really no oversight. Those, if there is an in custody death, there is not a mandated investigation, independent investigation that happens. It's really at the discretion of the county sheriff who oversees the jail. And so I think that, the work of journalists, especially when it comes to monitoring what's happening in county jails, is really important. And the two main forms of accountability that exist are lawsuits for civil rights violations and then the ballot box. If voters don't like the way that their sheriff runs the jail, then that could be another form of accountability. But I think the data says that, incumbent sheriffs generally keep their jobs. So I don't actually know how effective that is.
Great. Thank you. We'll be back to you in a second. I want to turn to John Washington. John is an investigative reporter at Arizona Luminaria, a community-focused media outlet. He writes about the border, climate change, democracy, so much more. John's written for The Atlantic, The Washington Post, The Nation, The Intercept, lots of other outlets. He's a translator and an author. I hope I've got this right, John. Your most recent book is The Case for Open Borders. Arizona Luminaria has been publishing investigative stories about deaths in the Pima County Jail since November of 2022. At first, the reports of in custody deaths were a trickle, kind of inconsistently reported by the sheriff's department, but it became a stream. And like Wyoming, people are dying in the Pima County Jail at a rate higher than other jails around the country. From 2022 to August 2023, 38 men and women have died inside the jail or shortly after being free. That's according to medical examiner records. It's also complicated. People are dying for lots of reasons. In Pima County, the healthcare inside the jails is run by a for-profit company. I will say a company that has serious problems, but people in jail have mental health needs, substance abuse needs. A lack of affordable housing contributes to a population that winds up in jail. And so, John, I guess my first question to you is also like, where did this story start for you? What made you and Luminaria want to take on this large project?
Thanks, Ellen. And yeah, thanks to you, Tennessee, too. Some really interesting thoughts. I have some questions for you. Before I jump into it, I probably should lead with mentioning that I recently got wrapped into the race for sheriff, which the Democratic sheriff, Chris Nanos, is on the ballot. And just a week ago, he put on leave his Republican opponent for a couple different things. One, supposedly supporting someone who was illegally campaigning. And the second thing was for colluding with a journalist in granting access to stories. And within a couple hours of that press release, it turned out that that journalist was me. And it's been a whirlwind of a week and 2 days and kind of awful. Did not ever mean to become part of the story myself. But there was a number of accusations leveled against me and the opponent, Sheriff Nanos' opponent. Supposedly, he has contacted the FBI and the Attorney General to further investigate. So there's only a little bit I'm allowed to say about it. But
Okay.
what I can say, but I can't really jump into this conversation without mentioning that. It's very front of mind for me. I can say that the allegations seem to be around us reimbursing an inmate for communications. We've done that a single time. It was $20 to an inmate who has written me 5 or 6 letters and has called me probably 8 or 9 times over the years. And he has frequently run out of money. He's been in and out of jail for a couple of years. And I went to the jail in person and put $20 on his account through like the reverse ATM kiosk. And that is, as far as we know, what we're being accused of doing. So, just to keep in mind, repercussions could rebound right back at you when you're doing these kind of investigations. The way that we first got into this story was someone came to me with not even really a tip, just saying like, people have been dying in the jail. You should know about it. And I started looking into it, and I got put in touch with a mother of a young man who had died in the jail not that long before, and she convened for me this gathering of a couple other mothers who had all lost young sons in the jail, and the 5 of us met at a Dunkin' Donuts, and it was a very heart-wrenching couple hours, and nobody ate a single donut. And they just laid out for me what they had gone through and what, as far as they knew, their sons had been going through. And yeah, as you mentioned in your introduction, Ellen, for a number of years, Pima County Jail here had been seeing a disproportionate number of deaths. So, we did the calculations, and it was per capita higher than Rikers Island, per capita higher than LA County or Harris County or Cook County, some of the most notorious jails in the country. And, even those numbers, just like crunching those numbers became a source of high tension in the community. The sheriff's department just refused to admit how we were calculating the numbers. They wanted to, and so these sort of things can pop up. They wanted to calculate not per capita, but per booking. And that's just not how the Bureau of Justice Statistics, which looks at these numbers, does the calculation. So if you want to do apples to apples, that's just not how you can do it. But this was, I think, sort of like an initial defense that the sheriff's department had, and even the county itself pushed back on a little bit. And yet, we kept on digging. We published a really long investigation, as you mentioned, in November 2022. And that led to, besides just trying to understand that how many people were dying and the cause and manner of death, but looking a little bit about some of the systems around them that were not protecting them, or maybe doing worse than that, allowing drugs into the jail, not properly putting people through detox, not doing just the most basic medical care for people. So some folks with mental health conditions were not being screened or evaluated or put on extra watch, or they had an infirmary where supposedly people were under watch, but there's a couple different cases of people committing suicide in the infirmary, which is, I've been in the jail a few times and I've seen it. It's glass walls and supposedly open to view pretty much constantly, but that clearly wasn't happening. What I want to get to is, and then I'll kick it back to you, Ellen.
Keep on going.
is now in the past 14 months, I believe it is, we've only had a single death in the jail, and that was about 10 days ago. And that man, as far as it seems, died from complications that were not directly relevant to the jail. So we've gone on an incredible streak. The turnaround was complete. I mean, from a disproportionately high rate of death to 0 deaths for over a year. And what that, I think, tells me, and that has told a lot of community members, is that, okay, so this was possible before. And I can talk a lot about some of the measures that have been taken, I think compelled in part on some of the reporting and some of the community engagement and oversight that's happened since we started reporting. But they really have turned it around. And I think that is really, really telling.
That's remarkable.
Yeah.
First of all, I'm sorry you become such a focal point. That is really difficult.
Yeah.
And I will respect whatever boundaries you put on what you can say, because I don't want to contribute to anything to put you in the crosshairs of anybody more.
Thank you.
So the change is astounding. Is it the same company that has oversight on the healthcare, and what did you learn about them? And have they just gotten better? Because they didn't seem to have a particularly good background going in, and I wonder what you learned about them.
Right. I learned a lot about them. So the company is NAFCare. They're Alabama based, and they do jail, or rather healthcare in various different carceral settings throughout the country, or at least in a number of different states. And I think this points to some of the challenges with relying on private for-profit healthcare, is that corner cutting. And this is something that we were able to show by looking at the county's oversight of their contract. So the county used to run healthcare, as it does in a lot of other different jails. They used to run the healthcare inside, and then it started getting expensive for them. And also there's a different type of liability that they were subject to. So they started contracting out, and this is a trend that's happening across the country. And they hired Centurion, and then it did not go well, and they hired then NAFCare 3.5 years ago. And At first, they were paying actually a little bit more than they had been paying before to do the healthcare themselves. And yet, this new company was grossly understaffed. And this was something that we were able to look at because the county every month does this very basic audit. They don't go in and actually look at the facility, but they just look at some of the numbers. And they saw that they calculate the hours of each position that should be filled. And there were things like a couple months where more than one person died from complications of withdrawal. The detox facility was understaffed by like hundreds of hours. As we're able to point like, very clearly at some of the major issues in staffing, or whether or not people were being screened for prior drug use or being screened for mental health conditions. And we saw that they were not being effectively screened, and the county was doing a sort of grading system, and they would grade them sometimes in the teens for some of these tasks that they're supposed to be doing. And we saw the direct consequence of people were dying. What has happened since then is they've hired some new staff and new leadership locally to oversee NAFCare, well, as part of NAFCare, as NAFCare leadership. And they've actually just been putting a lot more money into the services that they're offering. And so medical assisted treatment is the way that it's often sort of termed, and that is for people who have any sort of substance abuse disorder. They are going through the system where typically they're giving them some sort of withdrawal type drug, buprenorphine or Suboxone, things like that. And they're spending a lot of money on it. I mean, over a third of the entire jail is now receiving some sort of medicated treatment for withdrawal or substance abuse issues. And almost 100% of people go through detox now. That is, so they are actually closely monitored now. These are also the completely glass-walled things. The conditions are really trying in these parts of this facility, to where they'll have 9, 10, sometimes more people lined up, not in beds, but on what they call boats on the ground. And a lot of the people are suffering really intense withdrawal symptoms. So they'll be feverish, shaking, vomiting, angry, and people are sort of sardined in together with these facilities. And every couple of days they take them out. They get very, very little outdoor time. They power wash because there's just the conditions get so nasty inside. They power wash it and they lead them back in. Almost everyone's going through that. So the response has been, I think, potentially you could see this as positive, that people are getting some sort of medication, but also the conditions that they're suffering in. And a lot of people also aren't suffering from withdrawal symptoms, but have to go through this anyway. And it's really, really difficult. Usually at least 5 days in detox, and often it's more than that. A couple of things I'll throw out quickly of some of the responses or a new approach to trying to keep people from dying is automatic sending people to a crisis response center, which is in a local hospital, if they admit to using opioids within the last 24 hours. That, however, has what seems to be some loopholes. So some people go to the crisis response center and then seem to not get back into the jail, which is in some regards good for them. But I think, Tennessee, you were alluding to this too. Some of them are back on the street and they are actually suffering pretty intensely. And so there's no longer any supervision of them at all. And so it's very difficult to be able to track those people. And then the last couple of pieces of this, which have turned around the number of deaths, are much better screening for drugs. Drugs were getting in the jail very readily a few years ago. And I think they're getting in a lot less right now. And then staffing. But the staffing has been another issue too, and again, as you mentioned, Tennessee, you covered a lot. Staffing morale right now is hard. People are working a lot of hours. A lot of them are just out of the academy and are incredibly young. I mean, there are 18-year-olds that are in charge of different parts of the jail, and you go and they look at them, they look like I mean, they barely seem like they're 15, 16 when you look at them, and they're doing really hard, stressful demanding work with potentially severe consequences.
Wow. Well, we have a number of questions, so I'm going to put my questions aside and read some from the audience. Did your investigation, I guess this would be really for both of you, include inmate on inmate violence or homicide? The reason I ask this is the only jury I ever served on was a murder case that happened in a 7-by-7 jail cell occupied by 4 men, of which 2 men were charged with stomping death and physically weaker cellmate who was suffering from mental illness, and it seemed to have been arrested in the area of homeless encampments. So I guess just in the different kinds of ways people died, did you also notice that the conditions might have created violence situations? Either one of you?
I could answer real quick. So I have a short answer. Since 2022, I don't think there's been a single inmate on inmate death in Pima County Jail. It's a very serious issue for assaults, and it's pretty common, but none of them have led to deaths in recent years.
Yeah. Tennessee, do you find anything like that in Wyoming?
Not that I know of.
Right.
But but I'm doing the way that I'm getting the information is by doing the records request to all 23 counties, asking them for death in custody and cause of death. And then the other place that I get information is when the sheriffs opt to have an independent investigation. The Wyoming Division of Criminal Investigations does that, and I'm able to request their investigations once they're closed.
Right.
And so just like, it's possible that it's happened, but from the net that I've cast to get records back, I haven't seen that.
Yeah, you're hand stitching the data together, and it's based on whether or not some of it is based on whether or not a local official asks for an investigation. John, have you or Luminario written about your situation? Have you told the public about it, or have you?
Yeah, so there's a couple articles that came out right away that were not written by us, that were misrepresenting what happened, and we really wanted to respond, but also had to be very careful because we know that we presume that there is some investigations happening, and we explained more or less what I said at the beginning, that we reimbursed an inmate once, and that we don't pay for stories, and we have never and would never pay for stories. We just also, the optics of it are, I kind of think, speak for themselves. So we're not trying to wade into the political electoral policy here, but currently the Republican candidate who is challenging the sheriff is still under gag order on this, and is still, or might be lifting today, on suspended leave, where effectively she's not allowed to campaign either, because she has to be at home while she's on leave, which is a really sort of bizarre situation we find ourselves in, just over a week from the election.
Yeah. Wow. Have either of you run into deaths not being reported or provided to you as jail deaths because the person died elsewhere, like in a hospital, even though the person was a ward of the jail? You're shaking your head, John.
Yeah, this is something we've looked at a lot. So, the Death in Custody Reporting Act, which was 2014, you'd have to check on that date, but this is something that, as you mentioned at the top, Ellen, is not being followed, and the Department of Justice has had a really hard time enforcing. There's actually no enforcement measure in the law, and it is pretty narrowly construed, where you have to be a ward, as you say. And yet there is actually some gray area here too. is somebody in custody if they're being chased, for example? Like that's a question that is not clearly answered, or is at least I think a lot of sheriffs would say, or law enforcement say no, because they could get the numbers of people would go up. Also, when we came across one case, Joseph Zarate, who was suffering very badly in the jail, and he was going to be released, and as he was being released, his heart stopped, and sheriff's deputies, or correction officers rather, took him to the hospital, and they were there present with him while his heart stopped again. He had to be resuscitated. He died like 2 or 3 days later in the hospital. But there, the sheriff's department said it wasn't an in custody death, but sheriff's officers were present as his heart stopped. So what does that count as? It's hard to exactly say. One thing we've seen here too, and this has been in part, I think, a response to some of our reporting, is the medical examiner is pretty sympathetic about the community misunderstanding about what jail conditions are like, and community just consternation about the policies of the sheriff's department. And they started the first ever in the country publicly facing dashboard that counted deaths within 30 days of being released from custody. And this is something that was incredibly helpful to us reporting, because we were able to find these people and understand why they died. And there were a lot of suicides. There's a lot of overdose deaths as well. That was by far the highest cause of the deaths. The sheriff's department was furious with this, because even though they didn't count as in custody deaths, it made them look bad. And through pressure, they have now taken down this dashboard. But the medical examiner is still tracking it, and we can request and get the data. So we are able to see how many people die within 30 days of jail. I mean, the effects of incarceration do not end when you're out the door, of course. And this is to really understand and grasp what it does to a person. You need to look beyond the bars as well. And I think this is something that should get more attention across the country. And I think it's really shocking to see how many people die soon after leaving jails or prisons.
Yeah. Did either of you have trouble getting access to the jails? Tennessee, were you able to get inside? Was it hard? Were there obstacles? Just curious.
Well, the one time I tried, I did get access. Yeah. So, but I mean, it definitely took some work, and what I was able to see was very controlled, and I didn't get to talk to folks who were currently incarcerated when I was there. Yeah. What about
how
John?
much?
Did you get in? I'm
Yeah.
curious if you got into Pima County.
Yeah, I've been in a few times. As I've mentioned, like my relationship with the sheriff's department is a little strained, and it's been strained on and off for a few years. So it took a lot of work as well. But I was able to get in. One time it was very controlled, and the second time it was not so controlled. I was able to talk to people who were being held there. But I mean, this to me, I think that usually it's not that revealing. I mean, you see the infrastructure of what the jail looks like, but having a second long or few second long conversation with someone while there's your handler looking over your shoulder isn't really that illuminating. What I think it is more is talking to people who are either currently inside or recently inside, and then what really can open up sort of a view to what the workings of the jail is, getting sources who work there, and that is a really important piece, not essential, but it can change the way you understand it, but it's very hard to do.
Yeah. Tennessee, one of the things that you came to find is that lawsuits are kind of right now the most effective way to change things. Of course, that's problematic because lawsuits are pretty
Mm,
piecemeal. But you did find one
yeah.
county where things um, seem to be better than other counties. There was 0 in custody deaths over the past decade. And I wonder, first talk a little bit about lawsuits. Was that a good source of information as you were reporting? And also maybe talk about this county. What's going on there? What, are they doing something different?
Yeah. So, um, let's see. I'm trying to parse this out. One thing I would say in terms of trying to figure out where to get information, um, that I realized kind of late in the process is that um, Pacer is a great tool for just look to see if there have been uh, cases filed, because they would be, most often they would be federal civil rights violations, and so um, that's one place I would look. In terms of the efficacy of lawsuits, I mean, I feel like it's one of the only tools, but I think there's a dynamic where the like a county's bottom line is not necessarily impacted by a lawsuit because many counties are insured. And so if there's a buffer, like the taxpayers are not actually hit by that lawsuit, so they might be sort of aghast to find out like how much a settlement has paid out, but oftentimes because they're insured, and this is pretty common for law enforcement across the board, um, it doesn't hurt taxpayers, and so
Mm,
it doesn't have the kind of sway that I think people would hope. So we hear about these higher profile cases where they're really big settlements, millions of dollars, and from what I found, at least in Wyoming, that's kind of an anomaly. Like there's a cap on what can be paid out, and so and it's paid by insurance. Um, so so even that, I don't know how effective that is. But what is, I think, important is that lawyers who sue on behalf of plaintiffs, they get a ton more information than I do. Like the narrative is right there, like all of the details of what's happened is there. And that was the case with this one suicide in Laramie County. So that's Cheyenne, Wyoming. There was a lawsuit after a young man took his own life, and his family decided to sue. And their attorney just really dug into some of the structural issues, staffing issues, training issues that contributed to his death. And part of that suit was saying, like, you need to change your approach. So, that was one example. And then, yeah, I feel like this other county, Sublette County, that hadn't had any deaths. I mean, Alan, it feels like sort of a squishy answer, but it was really, I don't know if the policies on the books were any different. It just felt culturally different.
hmm.
It
Say
wasn't
a little more about
codified.
that.
I mean, the elected sheriff and the folks that he oversaw that ran the jail, like they their attitude was, um, folks who are incarcerated are human beings. We should treat them as such. We have a constitutional duty to take care of them. Uh, Taking care of prisoners makes the staff safer. But I think the dynamic there could change if you ended up with a different
Mm,
sheriff. And so, you know, for better or for worse, in our reporting, we tried to point out, like, it's not codified, it's cultural.
yeah,
This sheriff and the people who've worked here for decades have shaped that culture. And then we sort of asked the question, like, if they were to leave,
yeah,
what would happen? Just
yeah.
to sort of let people know, like, you can't look to the legislature of Wyoming, you can't look to federal regulations. What happens in this county jail is decided by your sheriff. It's like a civics lesson.
So interesting. John, you mentioned about the cultivation of sources, and you had a lot of sources from families. You had people who worked inside the system. Not all your sources wanted to go public, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you handled that.
Yeah. Going back to the last question too, I mean, that looking at the lawsuits was one way that I was able to develop some of these sources, because people who are named in lawsuits include correctional officers. And I think one of the best sources I've had was by finding that name, finding that person on Facebook, sending a couple messages, and it took a while, but they eventually responded to me. And through that first individual, I was able to gain a number of other sources, including people who were and still are working inside the jail. So yeah, I think again, going back to the last question, like there's you have to really kind of understand the culture, and a lot of people here are pretty nervous who work in the jail or work for the department are very nervous about potential repercussions. There's everyone I talk to who has worked in the jail calls it like the good old boys club, and it's this long-standing sort of almost like fraternal culture where in a lot of cases it can turn abusive. So it's hard to get people to go on the record, and I haven't been able to get anyone to really like blow the whistle, but they've really informed my reporting. And we've been able to use some of these anonymous sources by corroborating with multiple other sources. So if you get enough of them, you can actually go to press with it. And we, even if we don't name them, we have to get material proof that they're currently working there, and they are who they say they are, of course. And then they can just really at least guide the reporting. Family, however, I think is pretty different, and they, for the most part, have been wanting to go on the record. I mean, especially for people who have lost loved ones in the jail, they're so incensed and like, almost like nothing to lose. Like, of course I want to go public with this. And a lot of them are suing. There's almost like a cottage industry in this county now of attorneys who are helping people file these lawsuits against the sheriff's department or against the jail.
Yeah.
Then people who are in or who are recently in, there's a number of ways to try to cultivate those sources. One is standing outside the jail when people are released. There are a couple different periods during the day when people are done with their court. So around 1 or 2 in the afternoon, most weekdays, and then later at night. And I've done that a couple times. And, it's not like maybe you run and you got a story out of it, but you get a sense. And I think that's really important too, just kind of to keep track of how things are changing in the jail and what experiences are like. You need to talk to a lot of people. And one other way is, and you alluded to this previously, Ellen, about, the tying in with people who are rendered homeless. And there's a number of parks where folks congregate, and you go and you hang out there for a while, and a lot of these people are criminalized many times for that very fact, and other times for something somewhat related to it, and they're in and out of the jail a lot. And you build a little bit of trust there, and these can be really good sources, and they can explain to you what things are like or who's in there, what happened recently. So that's something I've been able to do as well.
Great. I wonder if the both of you could talk just about the impact that your reporting has. I mean, John, I don't know if you want to take full credit for the lack of deaths, but Tennessee, talk a little bit about looking back on the reporting now. What kind of impact has it had?
I have to admit I haven't done the request to see where we're at in 2024. So I'm not sure if there's been a change in the numbers at all. But, I think 2 things have happened. One, this wasn't really a part of the public agenda. I did not hear elected officials or state lawmakers talking about this, and now they are, but
That's
they're just
right.
conversations. But I also think I put WildFowl on the map as a news outlet that cares. And so people will call us and tell us when, you know, their neighbor that was booked in, like, never came home and they find out that he's died. And so I feel like just the initial step of like having more eyes and ears, and that feels like a pretty significant start. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And John?
Yeah, same. You know, there has been an impact. I certainly will not take credit for all of it. I think that we've been a piece of the public scrutiny on the jail, and I think we've been an important piece. But there's also been groups that have developed around, like organizations that have developed around trying to put more oversight on the jail and the sheriff's department, and it has been much, much more in the conversation. I mean, county leaders, boards of supervisors, state legislatures, legislators, and of course, sheriff's department. They know we're looking. And also, I think we've helped drive more reporting. And so other local outlets, the daily newspaper has, you know, wasn't reporting on this. They just weren't, and they are now. And I think that's definitely a win too. I mean, no single newsroom is going to be able to really do all the work. And so, you know, making sure you're working in concert with, you know, your colleagues in other outlets is really important as well.
That's great, and that's sort of a perfect segue, because I think county jails exist everywhere, right? And there's a lot of reporting available to people to probe. And I wonder, you know, you've got a tip sheet that we'll distribute, as I mentioned, but I wonder, like, what do you wish you knew at the beginning of your reporting on this topic, that you know now that you wanna share with this group?
I mean, I think one of the most important lessons that I learned, because I came to information about the death not always through lawsuits, but through investigations that were written. And I assumed that the families of the people who died knew what happened to their loved ones. And in most cases, they had you know, just the surface level information. And so just it felt really important to reach out to them, to get comment, but also, you know, I realized the hard way that it's super important to reach out to them to know that your story is going to come out, even if they don't want to comment, and for them to know what's in there, because you might be sharing information about the indignity of how their loved one dies, and it's highly likely that they have no idea. And so it's better for them to hear it from you first than to read it in the paper.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
How about you,
that's
John?
yeah, that's really hard. I've been in that situation a number of times too. I think I agree. It's really important, and yet it's just a really delicate and difficult conversation to have. I think what I didn't realize, though I should have, is, and I've already alluded to this a little bit, that trying to tell the story of what happens in the jail, you need to look outside the jail a lot. And there's so many other issues. It's really a systemic problem why people are dying in the jail, and has as much to do with conditions inside, whether or not they're getting treatment, as it has to do with why they're being put in jail in the first place. Has to do with what the availability is for housing, for medical treatment, for mental health treatment, and you know how just our society treats people who are marginalized and how we decide to criminalize them. And you know what we're trying to do right now, we have a couple really big reports that we've been working on, one for over a year. We're working on a mini documentary, and we're looking at how our county and how our, you know, Southern Arizona deals with mental health. And what we found is that we increasingly deal with mental health crises and people who suffer mental health issues and don't have support by locking them up. And you know, the number of people who either have addiction disorders or a mental health illness is amounts to over 50% of the jail population.
Mm.
And a lot of the people who are in there remain in there because they can't afford to pay bail, or because they're repeat offenders, and offenders as in like so some very basic offenses like failure to appear is an incredibly common offense here, and it results in felony charges that land you in jail, and yet the people either are sometimes even actually officially ruled incompetent to understand what's going to happen in their trial, and yet they're expected when they're out to show up for court on time. And if they don't, they can be sent back to jail, and it becomes this cycle. And so you really have to just start widening your gaze if you want to understand why people are dying in jail.
That's so helpful. I will add one more for both of you, because I know this is really hard reporting on the people reporting it as well. And so take care of yourself, and take care of the people in your newsroom. And it sounds like both of you are doing the best you can under those circumstances. I could keep on talking to you, but I'm going to try and get us done by 1. John and Tennessee, thank you so much. As I mentioned,
Thank you.
you've put together this tip sheet. These guys are great resources. Their work's amazing. There's also a lot of other work out there, really excellent work. The Texas Observer has done a huge project on death in jails. Same with Reuters. So there's other good big reporting, but this is a local story. This is happening in your backyard. Everyone who's registered, you're going to be getting an email from FIJ sometime in the next week. There'll be a link with the recording of the webinar and the tip sheet. Just a few reminders. The deadline for submitting proposals for regular grants is January 27th, 2025. The deadline for seed grants, these are grants for sort of that preliminary reporting to figure out, like, do you have a story and how big a story? These are up to $2,500, and the deadline for those applications is January 31st, 2025. If you have questions about applying, or you want to make a suggestion for a webinar, you can email us at grants@fij.org. And also, if you go to the FIJ website, under resources, there's a FAQ, there's a video to help with the application processes. We want to help you make the best possible application possible. Our final webinar this year is Friday, November 15th. We're going to be hearing from the team behind the podcast, The 13th Step. This is an award-winning investigation into abuse in the substance recovery centers. And like we heard today, it also resulted in the reporter, her family, her news organization becoming the target for some really bad stuff. So if you haven't listened, maybe try to listen to an episode or 2, and I hope you can join us on the 15th. Again, John and Tennessee, thank you so much. Thank you for the reporting that you're doing. It's just so important, and we're so glad that FIJ could be part of supporting getting that work out into the world. So thanks everybody for joining us, and have a great weekend. Take good care.